Welcome to Big Picture Walks Stay-at-Home Edition. Please comment, share, like, and subscribe. Today, I'd like to talk about the making of the global economy, about the timeline along which we have come from being a set of isolated hunter-gatherer tribes to a fully integrated global economy. I would like to cover at least two issues. I would like to discuss the sheer size of groups into which we organize, but I would also like to discuss the connectivity between the groups. Both size and connectivity of groups in which we organize are essential to the size of the immortal collective brain, which determines the scale of operations in the human civilization in the overall global economy. And thanks to increasing returns to scale, this also determines the pace of economic growth. The first building block of the discussion I'm going to make is a set of concentric social circles. That's a theory put forward by Dunbar, a psychologist and primatologist. Circle of roughly 5 people of our immediate family. Then we have a greater circle that includes also some of the more extended family and some of our friends. And then we have a group of 50 people, 150 people, and so on and so on. So the Dunbar's number is a famous finding by Dunbar, who says that our brains, the human brains, are built in a way that we can accommodate up to 150 contacts with other individuals. Accommodate meaning like we should be able to not just know who they are, but also understand how they are related to one another and know a few basic facts about their daily lives. So this is the group of 150 people. And it's no surprise that actually throughout the history, people have been organizing naturally into groups of pretty much this size. So you had roving bands that tended to be like 30 to 50 people, typically of kin, and then you have a wider group like a tribe, which typically had about 150 people. And so that was the reality of the world before the agricultural revolution. When people were hunter-gatherers, typically they operated within bands and tribes of sizes like 50 and 150 respectively. So this is the structure of our social contacts that is determined by the structure of our brain. But then later, after the agricultural revolution, when states began to form and wider groups of people began to organize, we tended to appreciate also further outer circles of acquaintances. So you can extrapolate this sequence to have a group, to have a circle of 500 people, 1,500 people, and so on and so on and so on. And essentially, what this meant was that greater and greater groups were formed that corresponded to our local community. Maybe to some local kind of identity like a town, city, or a region, or like a small group of villages or something like that. And eventually, as time passed, people more and more began to understand the concept of a nation. And it's of course disputed when the concept of a nation truly was forged and when it was universally understood. But like these days, for sure, we operate casually with this concept, which is an essential part of our identity. And even going beyond the nation, You could think of like supranational identities, like you can say, okay, I am, for example, I'm Polish, but I also subscribe to being part of the Western world. And finally, you could think of a global identity. You could think of being a citizen of the world, identifying with the whole world. Many people think in terms of their nation at most. Maybe more and more of us tend to understand that they also have these broader identities, but maybe that's a rather new phenomenon. And if you look at the development of the human civilization through the lens of these concentric social circles, you immediately see that as time passed, people tended to organize into wider and wider circles. And after the era of hunter-gatherers who organized into tribes, which were more or less isolated, and each of them was like more or less 150 people, then eventually, after agricultural revolution, we had first city-states in the Mesopotamian region. Uruk was roughly 50,000 people. Soon, much greater empires were also built, like the Egyptian empire in the lower Nile Valley, 3000 BC. That already amounted to about 1 million people. Later, you had even bigger empires. For example, you had the Achaemenid Empire in the Middle East, 500 BC, and that was roughly 30 million people, maybe between 20 and 50 actually, depending on the source. And the empires grew even further, and for example, China in the year 1500 CE had like 125 million. New technologies that were developed during the scientific revolution and further on during Enlightenment and in the industrial era allowed the size of state and the size of social group with which people identified to grow further. After so-called geographical discoveries and European colonial conquests, colonial empires were built, and for example, in the height of its functioning around 1920, the British Empire covered like 25% of total Earth's land area and about 25% of its population. After the Industrial Revolution, economic growth accelerated, population growth accelerated, the size of the global economy grew. It's not only the size of groups within which we organize that is important, but we need also to take care of the connectivity between those groups. So take a look at this simple graph. This is a schematic depiction of a world before the agricultural revolution. So you have a lot of small, isolated hunter-gatherer groups. Each of them lives in isolation and doesn't communicate with others. But then later, some groups may find it beneficial, in fact mutually beneficial, to engage in some trade, in some exchange of goods, but also of ideas. So some long-distance links are forged, like, I don't know, maybe from here to here, you can have a link, and already with such a network, you see that this group is able to achieve much more than any of the other groups because it already has much more nodes and many more connections within such a cluster. So as time progressed, maybe some more long-distance links were forged, maybe some were strengthened, like here. And so you had bigger and bigger clusters within the global network. And then eventually, you had periods like 130 BC, there was the establishment of the Silk Road that built a very long distance connection between Europe and China. So you can imagine it's like going from here, it's like going from here to here. It's a very long distance connection. Maybe you can also go through here, so you have a bit more connectivity there. And so as time passed, there was more and more trade, and there was more and more interaction in terms of ideas, exchange of ideas. However, still, even like in the Middle Ages, world was still very strongly fragmented and consisted of many groups that did not communicate with one another. And for one thing, the old world didn't even know of the existence of civilizations in the Americas. So if you think like the Aztecs and the Incas are here, and they were not at all connected to the old world. So after the scientific revolution, there was emergence of trade, and trade was a source of European fortunes. And then you had colonies, you had a lot of benefits from trade, also from exploitation of technologically disadvantaged regions, possible thanks to the fact that in the old world, the networks were somewhat bigger and somewhat better connected than anywhere else in the world. After the Industrial Revolution, things accelerated, so you had more trade in commodities, you had more migration, you had more transmission of information, especially after the telegraph and telephone. And that prompted subsequent trade liberalizations. Eventually, all these subclusters were connected, and we managed to become a small world network. Okay, so you connected here and here, I don't know, you built some long distance connections like here, maybe, you know, like this, maybe like this, maybe like this, maybe like this. So these days, with the internet, with global fragmentation of production, with global value chains, with instant communication across the globe, the network is strongly connected, which doesn't mean it's dense. It's still organized into subclusters, but now these subclusters are not isolated, but rather there are some long-distance bridges that allow the transmission of information, goods, and these days we also learn viruses across the globe. So in the end, we've come from a world of isolated clusters to a world of isolated clusters with a few long-distance bridges, and then to a world with more and more long-distance bridges, and eventually to a small world network where the distance between any two individuals in the world is probably like typically up to like 5 handshakes away. So what is the mechanism that brought us from being a set of autarkic hunter-gatherer bands to an intricate network of individuals in a global economy? There are at least 2 important elements to that, and the first one is human drive for local control, and the second one is increasing returns to scale. The human drive to maximize local control is conducive of our actions and enables us to achieve economic growth at the level of the entire world. So that's one building block. But then the second building block, an element that strongly determines the pace of growth at the global level, is the size of the immortal collective brain. So it's the size of the connected network of individuals who share their information. And this network has been growing throughout the human history, and it's been growing for 2 reasons. Well, first, because the groups in which we organized grew in size, and secondly, the connectivity between these groups also gradually increased. You may say that the size of the immortal collective brain grew from 1, which is typical for animals, then to 150, and that is the size of the tribe, and that was the reality of the hunter-gatherer times. but then it grew from 150 up to 7.7 billion, which is the size of the current world population, because now we don't have any isolated groups. Everyone is somehow connected to others, like maybe almost everyone, okay? Local control maximization is capable of achieving both great good and great harm. On the bad days, we treat the world as a zero-sum game. One's gain is someone else's loss. On the good days, it is a positive-sum game where we can all cooperate, join our forces, and eventually exploit increasing returns to scale, thanks to which progress can be accelerating. Business cooperation, trade, political alliances, and joint efforts in research and development, these are the main sources of progress because these are the main reasons why we can exploit increasing returns to scale at the global level and therefore achieve lasting economic growth. In fact, on balance, throughout the human history, technological progress and economic growth over the long run have been accelerating.